Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to explore a really critical dimension, something often, well, misunderstood in global economics and diplomacy.
Yeah, something that impacts billions of lives, but doesn't always get the headline attention.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're talking about financing for development, how it works, or maybe how it doesn't work, especially when you look at it from the perspective of developing nations themselves.
And that perspective is crucial.
It really is. We've got this fascinating address from a recent international conference, the fourth International Conference on Financing for Development, held in Seville, Spain, back on July 2nd, 2025.
Right.
And it offers some truly revealing insights into the nuanced realities of what's fundamentally at stake for a huge part of the world.
It's a viewpoint that definitely challenges a lot of the conventional narratives we hear.
It certainly does.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's unpack this.
Absolutely. And, it's such a vital perspective to grasp because these big international conferences, like the one in Seville, sometimes they might seem like just high-level talk, maybe political theater.
Yeah, just forums.
But they are actually crucial platforms where these fundamental economic realities get voiced, where national aspirations are laid out.
And where the, frankly, stark challenges faced by nations right on the front lines of development are brought to the global stage.
Exactly. And what's particularly fascinating about the material we're looking at today is how it cuts right to the core, right to the heart of global economic structures.
And specifically drawing on the perspective offered by the permanent representative of Eritrea to the United Nations, Ambassador Sophia Tesfamariam.
Yes, her statement really provides the backbone for our discussion. And it's important to stress this isn't just about understanding traditional development aid like handouts or loans in the old sense.
No, it goes much deeper.
Much deeper. It's a look into systemic issues, the very structure of the global system, and some pretty bold proposed solutions that fundamentally challenge how global finance even operates when it comes to development. #tag addressing fundamental challenges for developing nations.
That framing itself is powerful, and it makes the first point from the materials we reviewed even more striking. This idea that for many least developed countries, the LDCs, development isn't just, a policy choice or an economic strategy they might pursue.
It's described differently.
It's described as an existential imperative, that phrase.
Yeah.
Wow, it really conveys this profound sense of urgency. What does that actually imply for these nations? Why is that distinction so critical?
But it conveys a gravity that, honestly, for those of us in more developed economies, it might be hard to fully wrap our heads around.
Right.
For LDCs, development is quite literally about survival. It's about basic human dignity. Exactly. When we talk existential imperative, we mean things like eradicating extreme poverty, ensuring people have enough food, achieving food security, getting access to basic health care, providing education.
The fundamentals.
The absolute fundamentals. These aren't, long-term aspirations that politicians can debate percentages on or incrementally postpone year after year.
Not just items on a wish list.
Not at all. They are urgent, immediate priorities. They dictate the daily lives, the very survival, and certainly the future prospects of entire populations. Just think for a second about the impact of chronic hunger on a child's ability to learn, or the human cost of diseases we consider easily preventable, just because there's no basic sanitation or clean water.
It puts it in stark relief.
It really does, and it stands in such contrast to how development often gets discussed in more affluent countries.
How so?
Well, here it might be framed primarily in terms of, say, GDP growth targets, or maybe investment opportunities for our companies, or sometimes geopolitical stability, which are important, sure.
But different.
Very different. It's often not framed as this fundamental struggle for existence, for basic human flourishing. So that phrase, existential imperative, it forces us, or it should force us, to rethink how we typically frame development challenges from our, let's face it, more privileged viewpoint. It's not about optimizing growth percentages. It's about sheer survival and just laying the groundwork for a dignified future for millions.
That context immediately shifts the whole conversation, doesn't it? And the materials really emphasize that these aren't just isolated problems within these countries. They stem, it says, from deeper structural inequalities and systemic underdevelopment. That phrase, structural inequalities, what does that mean in practical day-to-day terms for these nations? And how do these deep-seated issues keep perpetuating themselves?
Right. In practical terms, it means they are often trapped, really caught, in this deeply entrenched, fundamentally imbalanced global economic model.
Okay.
The sources we looked at highlight this clearly. Many developing economies are locked into dependence on the extraction and export of raw natural resources with low value addition.
So digging stuff out of the ground, basically.
Pretty much. Raw materials, unprocessed, and at the same time, they're importing high-cost industrial goods. This isn't some accidental outcome. It's almost like a structural design, a legacy of history, you could say.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Imagine a country that's rich in, say, bauxite, the raw material for aluminum. Instead of processing that bauxite into alumina and then smelting it into aluminum metal, maybe even manufacturing aluminum products like window frames or engine parts.
Which would create jobs, skills, much more revenue.
Exactly, all those value-added steps. Instead, they're often structurally positioned, you might say, to just export the raw bauxite ore at a relatively low price, often set elsewhere.
Okay.
Then what happens? They end up having to import the finished aluminum products, maybe cars or construction materials, or even cookware made from their own resource, but at a vastly inflated cost.
So they're essentially exporting their potential wealth at a discount.
Yeah.
And then buying it back at a massive premium. They lose out on all the profitable steps in between.
Precisely. And the statement points out this dynamic perpetuates the transfer of wealth. Wealth flows out of the developing nation and towards the industrialized ones that do the processing and manufacturing.
Right.
And it actively constrains domestic development because it prevents these nations from building their own industrial base, from diversifying their economies away from just one or two primary commodities. It stops them generating those higher value jobs we talked about.
And you mentioned this isn't just history, it's ongoing.
Absolutely. Think about it. During colonial times, infrastructure, roads, railways, ports was often built with one primary purpose: get the raw materials out efficiently to the colonizers' industries.
Not to connect internal markets or support local business.
Rarely. And even after independence, many nations inherited that physical infrastructure, but they also inherited trade agreements, maybe even legal systems that were already tilted towards exporting primary commodities and importing finished goods.
So breaking that pattern is incredibly hard.
It's monumental. It requires not just political will, but huge economic re-engineering. You need massive investment in completely new domestic supply chains, manufacturing plants, skilled labor. It's incredibly capital intensive. And you're trying to do this in a global economy where the rules, frankly, often still favor the established players.
It sounds like a vicious cycle.
It is. A nation struggles to keep the wealth generated from its own resources. This directly hits its ability to create skilled jobs, to foster the kind of innovation that drives real sustainable economic progress. And they remain incredibly vulnerable to swings in global commodity prices, something totally outside their control.
Right, if the price of coffee or cocoa crashes.
Exactly. It makes planning for long-term development, building schools, hospitals, incredibly precarious.
That's a really powerful illustration of a fundamental economic trap. And it clearly has those deep historical roots, but as you say, continues to shape today's reality. Now, moving from that, the materials also point to another core constraint, which is related, the limited productive capacity of these economies. And it specifically notes the stagnation of the structural foundations of many African economies over the past 4 decades.
4 decades of stagnation. That sounds just incredibly significant. What does that really mean for people, for countries, and what on earth would it take to reverse such a long-term trend?
It means that for generations, literally generations, these economies haven't been able to significantly evolve beyond very basic levels of production and services. When economists talk about productive capacity, they mean a country's maximum potential output, its ability to produce goods and services efficiently, competitively.
Okay.
If that capacity is limited, it means they lack the modern factories, the advanced farming techniques, the sophisticated service industries, and crucially, they often lack the skilled workforce and the robust infrastructure, power, transport, communications that underpin a truly dynamic, diversified economy.
So the foundations themselves haven't been strengthened or modernized. That's what the stagnation of structural foundations implies. Over 40 years, many of these nations haven't undergone the kind of deep industrialization or agricultural modernization that's needed to escape that dependency model we were just discussing. They haven't built the powerful engines for their own growth, you could say.
They're kind of stuck in first gear, structurally speaking.
Yeah.
Constantly playing catch-up from a fundamental deficit.
That's a good analogy, yes. Exactly. And this is why the materials explicitly call for bold and sustained international support to build productive capacity in industry, agriculture, and services.
And this isn't just about aid money, you were saying earlier.
No, not just handing over cash, though resources are obviously needed. It requires comprehensive strategic support. Think about investing in that critical infrastructure we mentioned. You can't run modern factories without reliable power grids.
Right.
You can't get goods to market, internal or external, without efficient roads, rail, ports. You can't build a knowledge economy without modern communication systems.
And people.
Absolutely critical. Developing human capital. That means comprehensive education systems from primary school right through to university, and very importantly, relevant vocational training that equips people with the actual skills needed for modern industries and services.
In the systems around that.
Yes, institutional strengthening. Building effective government agencies, predictable regulatory bodies, robust legal frameworks that protect property rights and investments, transparent financial systems, all the software that makes a complex economy function smoothly.
It's a huge undertaking.
It is. And without building this foundational productive capacity, a nation just remains reliant on imports, even for basic things like processed food or clothes, even if they grow the cotton or the food crops themselves.
It seems crazy.
It limits job creation massively. It stifles local innovation because there's no ecosystem for it, and it keeps the economy incredibly fragile, vulnerable to external shocks like price hikes or supply chain disruptions. Reversing 4 decades of stagnation, yeah, it requires a sustained, probably multi-generational effort, addressing not just the symptoms, that's deeply embedded structural issues.
It makes perfect sense. And it seems tightly coupled with this limited productive capacity is the next point the materials highlight. Persistent technological barriers.
Mm-hmm.
They state that developing countries are hindered by limited access to global markets, restricted technology transfer, and restrictive intellectual property regimes. How do these specific barriers block progress? They sound incredibly interconnected, almost like they form a kind of technological blockade.
They absolutely are interconnected, and they form a huge hurdle. Let's break it down. Limited access to global markets. Okay, but that means even if a developing country did manage to build some productive capacity and produce competitive goods,
They still might not be able to sell them.
exactly. Protectionist policies in richer countries, complicated non-tariff barriers like stringent standards or regulations, sometimes outright discriminatory trade practices. They can prevent new industries from getting a foothold and flourishing. It stifles their ability to scale up.
Okay, that's market access. What about the technology itself?
This is perhaps even more critical. The statement points to the restriction of technology transfer and the prevalence of restrictive intellectual property regimes.
Technology transfer. That's sharing the know-how.
Yes, essentially. It's the crucial process of sharing knowledge, skills, equipment, manufacturing methods, even entire factory designs between countries or institutions. The goal is to make sure scientific and technological developments become accessible to a wider range of users, allowing them to adapt and build upon them.
And intellectual property regimes,
Mm-hmm.
patents and things.
Right. Patents, copyrights, trademarks. When these intellectual property rights are so tightly controlled, or the licensing fees are so high that developing nations simply can't afford them, or when the rules prevent them from adapting technologies to local needs, well, it fundamentally inhibits, as the statement says, the flow of vital knowledge and innovation.
So it's not just about being unable to buy the finished high-tech product. It's about being prevented from acquiring the knowledge and the means to make it themselves, to maybe leapfrog older technologies.
Precisely. That's the core of it. Think about, say, life-saving medicines during a health crisis. If strict patent protections prevent the local or generic production of those medicines, lives are lost.
Our green technologies.
Great example. Imagine a nation blessed with abundant sunshine and wind, perfect for renewables. But if they can't manufacture their own solar panels or wind turbines because the core technologies are locked up behind expensive patents and licensing agreements they can't afford.
They remain dependent on importing them, or just don't develop that potential.
Exactly. This isn't just about economic growth figures. It impacts public health, climate change adaptation and mitigation, national energy security, fundamental things. The argument here is that without equitable access to these advanced technologies, genuine progress remains severely constrained. It risks creating a permanent, ever-widening gap between the nations that own and develop technology and those that are essentially forced to remain consumers of it.
And digital technology must make this even worse.
Absolutely. The digital divide exacerbates this dramatically. Countries without affordable access to high-speed internet, advanced computing power, or even basic digital literacy skills for their population are increasingly marginalized in a global economy that's digitizing at lightning speed. It's a systemic barrier, a real impediment to genuine self-sustaining development, effectively preventing countries from becoming creators and innovators themselves.
It's clear these aren't just minor hurdles, but, as you said, systemic roadblocks, almost feeling like they're part of the design for some.
Yeah.
And then the materials bring up a particularly contentious issue, one that sounds really impactful given everything we've just discussed about needing capacity, technology, market access.
Yes.
And that's unilateral coercive measures, including sanctions, extraterritorial restrictions, and politically motivated trade barriers. This sounds like it could completely derail a nation's ability to develop.
It is indeed, and it's a point of incredibly deep contention in international relations and diplomacy. Unilateral coercive measures, that's the term often used, especially by those affected,
Right.
to describe economic or political pressure tactics applied by one country, or sometimes a small group of countries, against another outside of a formal UN Security Council mandate.
So not sanctions agreed upon by the international community through the UN.
Exactly. The UN Security Council is the only body legally authorized under international law to impose binding sanctions on member states. These unilateral measures bypass that multilateral process. They can range from comprehensive economic sanctions, restricting huge swaths of trade or financial dealings,
Okay.
to what the statement calls extraterritorial restrictions. This is a really key point.
What does that mean, extraterritorial?
It means, for example, a powerful country might impose penalties on a bank or a company based in a completely different third country just for doing business with the sanctioned nation,
Yeah.
even if that business is perfectly legal under the laws of that third country and international law.
Wow. So country A sanctions country B and then tells country C, you can't trade with country B or we'll punish you.
Essentially, yes. It effectively projects one nation's laws and its foreign policy goals onto the rest of the world, creating this kind of chilling effect on global commerce and investment. Companies and banks in third countries become afraid to engage, even in perfectly legitimate trade.
And politically motivated trade barriers.
Those are distinct from, say, health and safety standards. These are barriers, tariffs, quotas, complex regulations put in place not for genuine economic reasons, but specifically to exert political leverage or achieve political aims against another country.
And how are these viewed by the countries on the receiving end?
Well, as you can imagine, many nations, particularly in the global south, view these measures as violations of fundamental principles of international law, like non-interference in internal affairs. They see them as infringements on their national sovereignty, and they find them deeply problematic because they bypass those agreed-upon multilateral processes at the UN and, crucially, often end up hurting ordinary people, the civilian population, the most.
So it's essentially seen as using economic might as a weapon, potentially against a nation's development path. And the statement specifically mentions Eritrea has experienced this firsthand.
That is certainly the perspective articulated here, and it's how it's viewed by many nations that have faced such measures. The materials detail the effects quite starkly. These measures undermine the stability of developing economies, deepen poverty, and erode the principles of multilateral cooperation.
Undermining stability, deepening poverty. Strong words.
Very. And for Eritrea, Ambassador Tesfamariam's statement is explicit. It says they have experienced firsthand the stifling effects of such measures, which restrict access to capital, technology, and essential goods.
Can you give examples of what that restriction means in practice?
Imagine a country trying to build a critical dam for irrigation and power, but it can't access international loans or import the necessary turbines because of financial sanctions. Or imagine hospitals unable to import vital medicines or even spare parts for essential diagnostic equipment like X-ray machines.
Or farmers unable to get specialized seeds or tractors.
Exactly. Or just businesses being unable to engage in normal international trade, unable to get paid for exports or pay for imports through the international banking system. This directly impacts daily life for everyone: healthcare, food security, jobs, and it fundamentally derails long-term development plans. It creates a suffocating economic environment.
The chokehold almost.
It can feel like that, preventing nations from pursuing what the statement calls their self-determined development pathways, because their economic options, their access to the global system, are artificially and externally constrained.
And the argument here is that these measures don't just hinder development practically, but they actually violate international law and prevent nations from choosing their own path. That sounds like a direct challenge to the whole idea of national sovereignty.
It absolutely is a profound tension, and it goes right to the core of how international relations are supposed to function under the UN Charter. On one side, you have nations fiercely asserting their sovereign right to chart their own course, to choose their own political, economic, social systems, free from external interference, particularly economic coercion.
Principle of non-interference.
Yes. On the other side, you have powerful states employing these economic tools. They often justify them by citing concerns over things like human rights abuses, counterterrorism efforts, nuclear nonproliferation, or achieving specific geopolitical objectives. They argue these measures are necessary tools of foreign policy.
It's a fundamental clash of principles.
A very fundamental clash. From the perspective of many developing nations, especially those targeted, these tools are often perceived as a modern form of economic warfare, one that disproportionately harms the most vulnerable populations and fundamentally undermines the very multilateral system that's supposed to ensure global stability and cooperation based on shared rules and mutual respect.
Okay, so bringing it back to our listener, why should someone listening, maybe in a country not directly affected by sanctions, care about this?
That's a great question, because global stability is deeply interconnected. These measures don't happen in a vacuum. They can disrupt global supply chains for key commodities or manufactured goods, which can affect prices and availability for you. They can exacerbate humanitarian crises, which might lead to increased refugee flows and instability in entire regions. They create geopolitical tensions that impact international relations, trade negotiations, and even global security cooperation on issues that affect everyone, like climate change or pandemics. It's not an isolated issue concerning just a few countries. It sends ripples across the entire global system, really demonstrating how tightly intertwined our economies and societies have become. #tag pathways to a reconfigured global system.
That really highlights the global knock-on effects, showing how interconnected everything is. Now, let's pivot from the challenges to the solutions proposed in the materials. There's a call here for a bold reconfiguration of the global financial and economic system.
Yes, a very ambitious call.
One anchored in equity, sustainability, and solidarity. That's a massive vision. How is that bold reconfiguration defined, particularly for financing development? What would it actually entail, moving beyond just words?
It's defined by a fundamental shift in thinking, moving away from that traditional, often paternalistic view of development finance. Ambassador Tesfamariam's statement puts it very clearly. Financing for development is not about aid alone.
Okay, so it's not just about more money flowing from north to south.
No, the statement continues. It is about dismantling structural imbalances, enabling fair participation in global markets, and preserving national policy space for countries to pursue inclusive and sovereign development.
Right, let's break that down. Dismantling structural imbalances.
That goes back to what we discussed earlier, tackling the root causes of economic dependency, like that raw material export trap. It means actively reshaping the global system, the trade rules, the financial regulations, maybe even investment treaty patterns, so they don't inherently favor the already developed nations, but actually create a more level playing field.
Okay. Then enabling fair participation in global markets.
This implies needing comprehensive reforms to things like international trade agreements, those intellectual property laws we talked about that restrict technology access, and maybe the mechanisms for accessing international finance. The goal is to truly allow developing countries to compete equitably, to build their own diversified industries, rather than just remaining suppliers of primary goods or low-wage labor.
And the last part, preserving national policy space. That sounds crucial.
Absolutely critical. It means countries must have the autonomy, the freedom to design and implement their own economic policies, their own development strategies, their own social programs, tailored to their unique national circumstances and priorities.
Without external actors dictating terms.
Exactly. Without undue influence or restrictive conditionalities being imposed by powerful international financial institutions like the IMF or World Bank, or by individual donor countries as prerequisites for aid or loans, it's about empowering countries to genuinely chart their own course, rather than being forced to follow a prescribed, often one-size-fits-all, development blueprint designed elsewhere.
So it's not just about rebuilding the ship, as we said earlier, but fundamentally about letting the crew decide its own course and destination based on their own charts.
That's an excellent way to put it. It's about sovereignty and self-determination in the economic sphere.
And what specific changes would this kind of profound reconfiguration actually require? I mean, realistically, how challenging would it be to achieve this on a global scale? It sounds revolutionary.
It would require huge shifts, almost revolutionary, as you say, particularly in the power dynamics within key global institutions. Think about
Yeah.
the IMF and the World Bank. A genuine reconfiguration would likely mean reforming their voting structures and their executive board representation to give developing nations a truly equitable voice, moving away from systems where voting power is largely based on historical economic weight or contributions.
Giving the global south more say.
A much more significant and proportionate say. It would also probably involve a serious reevaluation of how international sovereign debt is handled. Maybe more accessible mechanisms for debt relief or orderly debt restructuring processes that don't cripple a nation's ability to function and invest in its future. Perhaps exploring things like debt for climate or debt for nature, swaps more seriously.
And in trade.
Re-examining WTO rules and trade agreements. Are they genuinely fair? Do they allow developing countries enough policy space to, for example, temporarily protect nascent infant industries until they can compete? Do they facilitate access to essential medicines and technologies? It would mean looking at all these rules through a lens of equity and development impact, not just market liberalization.
The challenges seem immense.
Immensely challenging, yes. It would require a level of global political will and consensus that historically has been very, very difficult to achieve. Why? Because fundamentally it challenges deeply entrenched economic interests and the existing global power structure, a status quo that frankly benefits many developed nations and powerful corporations. You'd expect significant resistance from those who gain from the current system. So yes, it would be a long, probably arduous political and diplomatic process, but it's one that many in the global south increasingly see as absolutely essential, non-negotiable for achieving genuine, sustainable development on their own terms.
That really puts the Seville outcome document's reaffirmation,
Yeah.
the part that says each country's primary responsibility for its own economic and social development, into context. Because as you noted, it immediately follows with that crucial caveat. It's not just about a country doing it all on its own.
Exactly. It's a really important balance they strike there. It acknowledges national effort, national ownership, a principle Eritrea itself clearly embraces. Its whole strategy is built on self-reliance.
Yeah.
But then it immediately stresses that this principle must be supported by international frameworks that empower rather than penalize countries that are striving for resilience and self-reliance.
Okay, empower rather than penalize. What does that mean in practice? How might current frameworks be seen as penalizing?
Well, empowering frameworks would be ones that actively facilitate access to finance on fair, non-predatory terms. Frameworks that promote genuinely fair trade, not just free trade that benefits the strong. Frameworks that support capacity building in ways that build genuine local capability without creating new forms of dependency or leading countries into unsustainable debt traps.
And penalizing.
Penalizing frameworks might be perceived as those that impose rigid, one-size-fits-all economic policy prescriptions. Think structural adjustment programs of the past, for example. Policies that might undermine local priorities or perhaps force rapid privatization of essential public services like water or electricity, even if that might not be in the country's best interest at that time or could harm the poorest.
Or tie aid to conditions that compromise sovereignty.
Precisely. Or demand harsh austerity measures during economic downturns, forcing cuts to vital social spending on health or education, which disproportionately hurts the poor and undermines long-term development. The call here is for a global system that actively helps countries build resilience and stand on their own feet, rather than one that, perhaps inadvertently, trips them up or pushes them deeper into dependency cycles.
So this makes Eritrea's own development strategy, which the materials mention, a really powerful case study, doesn't it? It highlights their long-standing prioritization of self-reliance, equity, and national ownership. How is that approach actually manifested on the ground, especially given the external constraints they've faced that we discussed?
It's a fascinating illustration, yes, of a nation attempting to forge its own path very consciously. Despite facing those significant external constraints, and the statement clearly links back to the unilateral coercive measures we discussed, which have undoubtedly made their development journey harder. Ambassador Tesfamariam notes that Eritrea has deliberately invested in human capital, infrastructure, institutional capacity development, emphasizing long-term sustainability over dependency.
And what does that look like in practice?
Well, investing in human capital isn't just rhetoric. It means prioritizing accessible and quality education, basic literacy, skills training right across the country, trying to ensure their young people are equipped for the future economy they want to build.
Yeah.
Investing in infrastructure means, for them, often building their own roads, developing their own power generation for energy security, establishing communication networks, frequently using internal resources, domestic savings, and national service initiatives, rather than solely relying on external loans or grants that might come with strings attached or follow externally imposed designs.
Building it themselves, literally.
In many cases, yes. And strengthening institutional capacity involves the hard work of building effective, transparent, and accountable national governance structures, legal systems, financial management systems. The whole emphasis on self-reliance means they're strategically aiming to build an economy that can sustain itself and meet its people's basic needs primarily from within.
Reducing vulnerability.
Exactly. Reducing vulnerability to external shocks, external pressures, and ensuring that development priorities are truly nationally owned and driven by their own assessment of needs, not dictated from outside. It's clearly a strategic long-term vision aimed at breaking free from those historical cycles of dependency.
That's a very clear commitment to an alternative development model, really aligning with that broader call we discussed for preserving national policy space. And this commitment seems to extend to how they view international cooperation and partnership as well. The materials state that Eritrea values cooperation and partnership that respects national priorities and ownership. Why is that specific element, respect for national priorities and ownership, so crucial in these development partnerships, as opposed to maybe a more top-down approach from donors?
Oh, it's absolutely critical.
Yeah.
Because it directly addresses those historical power imbalances and, frankly, some of the damaging legacies of past development cooperation efforts around the world.
How so?
When external actors, whether they're donor governments, international organizations, NGOs, even large private foundations, come in and impose their own agendas, their own ideas of best practices, or their own conditionalities tied to funding.
Right.
The solutions they propose often don't actually fit the local context. They might ignore local knowledge or local capacities, or they might even create unintended negative consequences down the line.
Or prioritize things the donor cares about, not the country's biggest need.
Exactly. They might fund projects that align with their strategic interests or visibility goals, rather than addressing the recipient country's most urgent fundamental needs as defined by the people themselves. Respect for national priorities means the developing country itself is in the driver's seat. They define their needs, they design the strategies, they lead the implementation.
And ownership.
Ownership ensures that the solutions are more likely to be culturally relevant, politically feasible within that country's context, and ultimately sustainable in the long run. Why? Because the local population and the government are deeply invested in their success. It's their project, not something imposed from outside.
It shifts the dynamic completely.
Completely. It moves from a dynamic that can feel like dependency or charity to one of genuine collaboration and partnership based on mutual respect. That's fundamental for achieving real, lasting impact and also for upholding the dignity of the nations involved.
That leads us directly to what seems like a huge piece of this self-reliance puzzle: domestic resource mobilization, getting countries to fund themselves.
The cornerstone, really.
Right. And the materials welcome the focus at Seville on international tax cooperation under a UN-led framework. But then it adds some really important qualifiers. Global tax cooperation must be fair and inclusive, must respect national sovereignty and reflect capacity constraints. Tax reform should not become hidden conditionalities. Wow, there's a lot packed in there, and it hints at some major grievances. What's the significance here, especially that call for a UN-led framework and the warning about hidden conditionalities?
This is absolutely monumental, and it strikes right at the heart of economic sovereignty and fairness in the global system. Domestic resource mobilization, first off, it just means a country's ability to generate its own funds, primarily through effective and fair taxation, but also other internal revenues to finance its own development priorities.
More sustainable than aid or loans.
Far more sustainable and far more empowering in the long run than relying on volatile external aid flows or accumulating crushing debt burdens through excessive borrowing. Now, the call for a UN-led framework for international tax cooperation, that's highly significant.
Why the UN specifically?
Because it implies a strong critique of the existing frameworks for setting global tax rules. Currently, many of those rules, especially the complex ones governing how multinational corporations are taxed on their global profits, have largely been shaped by a relatively small group of wealthy countries, primarily through organizations like the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development.
The rich countries club, some call it.
That's a common critique, yes. And the argument from many developing countries is that these existing rules, designed largely by and for developed economies, often fail to adequately address their specific challenges. Challenges like taxing the digital economy fairly, or effectively combating the massive illicit financial flows money lost through things like corporate tax avoidance, aggressive transfer pricing schemes, or funds hidden away in tax havens.
Billions lost every year.
Potentially hundreds of billions drained from developing economies annually, money that could be funding schools, hospitals, infrastructure. So the call for a UN-led framework is essentially a call to move the rulemaking to a truly universal democratic forum where all countries, rich and poor, large and small, have an equal seat at the table and an equal voice in shaping the rules that affect them all.
It's about democratizing global tax governance.
Exactly. That's what fair and inclusive means here. It must also respect national sovereignty, meaning countries keep the fundamental right to set their own tax rates and design their own tax systems according to their needs without external coercion. And it must reflect capacity constraints, acknowledging that developing nations often need significant technical assistance and support to build the modern, efficient tax administrations required to implement complex international rules fairly.
And that warning against hidden conditionalities. That sounds pointed.
It's very pointed, and it definitely speaks to historical experiences and deep-seated concerns. It implies a worry that even seemingly positive initiatives, like support for tax reform, could potentially be tied, maybe subtly, maybe overtly, to other demands or requirements from donors or international institutions, like requirements to lower corporate tax rates across the board, perhaps, or to adopt specific economic liberalization policies, or maybe to grant concessions in other areas. Requirements that might undermine a nation's chosen policy direction, force them into adopting certain economic models they don't want, or ultimately serve external economic interests rather than genuinely empowering the country to raise its own revenue autonomously and fairly.
So it's a call for genuine partnership in tax matters, not another lever for imposing external agendas.
Precisely. It reflects a deep desire for much greater equity in global financial governance and for concrete action to stop those massive illicit financial flows that consistently drain resources from where they're needed most. It's fundamentally about building a global tax system that helps ensure wealth is taxed fairly where it's actually generated, fostering genuine self-sufficiency and development from within.
That seems to be such a consistent theme throughout this whole statement, this push for equitable global structures that actually facilitate true self-reliance rather than making it harder or perpetuating dependency. And speaking of self-reliance, the materials highlight something really interesting, almost unique, as a cornerstone of Eritrea's economic strategy: the vital role of our diaspora.
Ah, yes, very important.
They welcome efforts to reduce the cost of remittance transfers, which makes sense, but then they stress that diaspora engagement for them is far more than just money coming in. It's also about knowledge transfer, entrepreneurship, and community-driven development initiatives. That sounds like a really powerful, multifaceted contribution, much broader than we usually think about.
It truly is, and it's potentially a model that holds lessons for many nations with significant populations living abroad. Most people, when they think of diaspora contributions, immediately think of remittances, that money sent home by citizens working overseas.
Which is huge globally, right? Often more than official aid.
Absolutely massive, often dwarfing official development assistance for many countries. And reducing the transaction costs for sending those remittances, which can sometimes be exploitatively high, is indeed important. It means more money arrives directly in the hands of families, boosting local consumption, supporting small businesses, improving livelihoods.
But the Eritrean statement goes way beyond that.
It really does. It paints a much more holistic, deeply integrated picture of diaspora engagement. It suggests they've consciously worked to transform their dispersed population into a powerful, organic engine for national development, leveraging far more than just financial capital.
So leveraging human capital, social capital too, in a really deliberate, strategic way.
Precisely. Let's look at those elements. Knowledge transfer. This involves skilled Eritrean professionals living abroad. Doctors, engineers, academics, IT specialists, you name it, contributing their expertise back home. Maybe they return permanently or temporarily to work. Maybe they mentor students or professionals remotely. Maybe they advise on policy or technical standards. They're bringing back invaluable skills and experience in areas that might be scarce domestically. It's about building human and institutional capacity from within, using their own national talent pool wherever it resides.
Okay, that makes sense. Then entrepreneurship.
This means members of the diaspora aren't just sending money for consumption. They're actively investing their savings, their business experience gained abroad, and maybe their international networks to actually start businesses in Eritrea.
Creating jobs, stimulating local economies directly.
Exactly. Fostering innovation, maybe bringing new business models or technologies. And then there's community-driven development initiatives. This is fascinating. It speaks to grassroots efforts where diaspora groups, maybe organized by town or region of origin, directly fund, organize, and sometimes even manage specific development projects back home.
Like building a school.
Building a school, constructing a health clinic, developing a clean water source, initiating an agricultural project, things identified as priorities by the local community itself. This direct engagement often bypasses cumbersome official aid channels, ensuring projects are deeply rooted in local needs, have strong local ownership, and direct accountability back to the communities and the diaspora members funding them.
It sounds incredibly empowering and a real model of self-reliance.
It really does represent a unique and potentially very powerful model of self-reliance and national ownership. It's about strategically leveraging a nation's total human capital, no matter where people physically live. It transforms a potentially dispersed population into this coherent, proactive force for development, deeply rooted in national identity and shared priorities. And significantly, it reduces dependency on traditional aid mechanisms and demonstrates a concrete pathway where a nation's own people, globally, contribute directly and proactively to their country's progress. It builds resilience, fosters long-term sustainability from the inside out, and truly embodies that spirit of self-determination they emphasize. #tech conclusion and call to action.
So as we kind of draw this deep dive towards a close, the core message coming through from Ambassador Tesfamariam's statement, and arguably for many developing states, particularly in the Global South, seems to crystallize around this one powerful sentence. The challenge has never been a lack of will or ideas. It has been a lack of fair rules, predictable support, and respectful partnerships. That feels like a really potent summary. It cuts right through a lot of those conventional narratives about why some nations struggle to develop, narratives that often focus solely on internal factors.
It absolutely does. And it's a statement that really should prompt some deep reflection for all of us. It fundamentally challenges that prevalent narrative, the one that often frames development challenges as primarily stemming from a lack of internal capacity or poor governance within the country itself, or maybe just insufficient financial aid flowing in.
It shifts the focus outwards.
Precisely. It places the emphasis squarely on the external environment, on systemic injustices baked into the architecture of the global economy itself, on the urgent need for genuinely equitable global structures, for fair play in trade and finance, and for international relationships based on genuine respect, not dominance or conditionality.
So connecting this to the bigger picture,
If you connect this to the bigger picture, it's nothing less than a call for a fundamental reimagining of how the world ought to cooperate on development. It's arguing for a shift from a model often perceived as charity or driven by donor interests towards one of genuine partnership. From conditionality towards respect for sovereignty and nationally determined paths.
it's arguing that potential is being stifled by the system itself.
Yes. The argument is essentially that until the rules of the game are made fair, until global partnerships become truly respectful of national sovereignty and locally defined priorities, the immense potential of many nations will remain tragically constrained, no matter how hard their people work or how ingenious their ideas are. It really urges us all to look beyond just individual country statistics or specific project failures and critically examine the global systems within which these countries are forced to operate.
And given that powerful critique and vision, the call to action directed towards that fourth International Conference on Financing for Development in Seville was very clear. The hope was expressed that it would be more than a forum for dialogue, but actually a catalyst for build and collective action.
Right. Moving beyond talk.
Exactly. So based on everything we've discussed today, what would that bold and collective action actually look like in this context? If this vision were to be seriously pursued, what would be the concrete next steps?
Well, bold and collective action here wouldn't just mean more financial pledges or slightly tweaked aid programs. It would mean tackling those systemic issues head on, concrete structural reforms,
Such as
a decisive collective shift towards that genuinely inclusive UN-led framework for global tax cooperation we discussed. Action to ensure multinational corporations truly pay their fair share of tax where they actually create value, making it much harder to just shift profits to low-tax jurisdictions or tax havens.
closing the loopholes.
Closing loopholes, rewriting rules. It would also likely involve a fundamental reevaluation and probably renegotiation of global trade rules to genuinely foster industrialization and economic diversification in developing nations, helping them move beyond just exporting raw materials. It would necessitate a move away from, perhaps even a prohibition on, those unilateral coercive measures, the sanctions and restrictions imposed outside the UN framework that disproportionately harm civilian populations and blatantly undermine national sovereignty and development efforts.
And reform of the big institutions.
Absolutely crucial. A fundamental reform of the governance and potentially the mandates of the international financial institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, to give developing nations that more equitable voice we talked about, to ensure that finance is available on terms that support development without crippling conditionalities that dictate policy, and perhaps to reprioritize long-term sustainable inclusive development over, say, short-term macroeconomic stability targets alone.
These are huge asks.
They are huge asks. They would require immense political courage from world leaders and a genuine willingness to challenge powerful vested interests and establish global power dynamics. But from the perspective laid out in this statement, these steps aren't just desirable, they're seen as essential prerequisites for unlocking the full development potential of every nation, for creating a truly just and sustainable global economy. And, this really raises a crucial question, perhaps for everyone listening. What responsibility do we all share, individually and collectively, in advocating for, or at the very least, striving to deeply understand and support a global financial and economic system that genuinely fosters equity, sustainability, and solidarity? One that empowers nations rather than perpetuating old, destructive dependencies. It makes you think. How do the rules of the game need to evolve to truly unlock the full potential of every nation, allowing for diverse, self-determined pathways to development that ultimately benefit all of humanity?
That is indeed a powerful thought to leave everyone with, and it really underscores why deep dives like this, looking through these specific lenses, are so important. Understanding the complexities of global development finance, not just from the donor perspective, but through the lived realities and articulate critiques of nations like Eritrea. It offers insights often missed in mainstream discussions. It certainly compels us to reflect more deeply on those core concepts we've touched on: genuine self-reliance, the meaning of equitable partnerships, and the often invisible systemic barriers that prevent so much of the world from achieving its full human and economic potential.
Indeed. It's a complex journey, global development. It can be frustrating. Progress often feels slow. But truly understanding the perspectives of those nations navigating these immense challenges firsthand, that's absolutely essential for anyone who wants to be genuinely well-informed about the state of our world. And just consider, finally, how that persistent pursuit of fair rules, predictable support, and respectful partnerships, if achieved, might reshape not just the fortunes of individual nations, but the entire global economy, potentially creating a much more just, stable, and prosperous world for absolutely everyone.
Thank you for joining us on The Deep Dive. Keep that curiosity burning, ask those tough questions, and we'll see you next time.